there are certain things that we faced as we evolved that, when missing as they are now, if we put them back in our life, we can improve our health, happiness. Like, chronic diseases are really a function of how little we now move and how much we now eat. Shit, I got to get out of my comfort zone, because sometimes I need a little bit of a kick in the ass to remind myself that I got it pretty good nowadays.
What's the backstory? Who are you? Introduce yourself to my audience.
Yeah, sure. So my name is Michael Easter. I am currently a professor at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, but a longtime journalist. So I worked at Men's Health magazine for a long time, maybe like 7-8 years. And before that, I did some stuff for Scientific American and Esquire and GQ. So kind of this mix of science magazines and dude magazines led me to this men's health job. And eventually, I ended up teaching journalism at UNLV. And half my job is continuing to write. And that's why we have a book.
Dude, that's awesome. When I was a kid in high school, I looked at Men's Health as being like the bastion of what was like cool and interesting in the health, fitness, and nutrition space.
Mm-hmm.
So that would have what you did probably would have been a dream job to me as somebody, like in high school.
Yeah.
It's great. So you've gotten to just like focus on whatever topic has piqued your interest, and then you just went deep for those articles.
Yeah. So I would say at Men's Health, I sort of became the guy who would find interesting people in interesting places doing something interesting. And I would kind of embed myself there. That's really what I love to do. So for example, I embedded myself in what was, I think, then considered maybe the world's most hardcore gym. It's this place called Jim Jones in Salt Lake City. I trained there for a while. I trained with these power lifters that trained out of this basically shack in the woods of Pennsylvania for a while. And it was The guy who ran it was the first guy to ever bench press 1,000 pounds. And I would just go there 3 days a week, hang out with him. And it was just super gnarly. I mean, if you can see me on screen, I'm a skinny dude. And these guys are like the size of a freaking 1960s Buick, but just sort of getting to know those characters and sort of finding the threads is always what really interests me.
Is that Gonzo journalism? Like where you immerse yourself in the subject that you're covering. You're not just covering a subject as an outsider. You're going in like fish out of water to experience what it is that you're covering.
Yeah. So I think that, when I hear Gonzo, I tend to think of Hunter Thompson.
Yeah.
And I mean, I'm definitely not like he did, sort of doing drugs and inserting myself and maybe sort of bending the story as well. But I do think that I tend to immerse myself in the subject, and I often write from a first person, not always, depending on the story. But for example, this book has a lot of first person. And the reason I do that, I think, where appropriate, is because at the end of the day, Men's Health magazine is trying to give the reader advice, right? It is a magazine that serves the reader. I consider myself more or less like the reader. So if I can tell them what it was like through my eyes, I think they'll be able to identify with that more potentially than they would with had I only had the voices of the guy built like a Buick who, bench presses 1,000 pounds. If I can tell you, hey, I'm this average dude, but here's what I learned from this person and how it translated to me, I hope that resonates more.
Yeah, you're the journeyman.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love that. So when did the idea for writing the Comfort Crisis begin to emerge?
Oh man, so handful of things. One thing is that 7 years ago, I got sober. So I come from this line of men who are just hell on wheels, frankly. a lot of prison records and jail records and just craziness. And, although at the time I would say that my life looked pretty together on paper, if you looked at, owned a house, owned a car, had a good job, place that people knew about, the wheels were sort of coming off personally, so getting sober basically was uncomfortable in like every way possible, because you kind of have to like relearn how to live more or less. And you have to do some self-investigation, I would say, about why were you drinking in the first place, man? And for me, it was because it made me comfortable in a lot of different situations, right? It's like, kill the stress of work. If I was in a social situation, it's like have a few drinks, that all of a sudden becomes a lot easier. So when I get sober, it's like I have to go through all this uncomfortable stuff that like yeah, I didn't really want to do it. But by doing that, I come out on the other side and I'm better for it. So I make this observation, right? Oh, I improved because I go through this discomfort. And then I end up doing this story for Men's Health with this guy whose name is Donnie Vincent. He's this backcountry bow hunter.
Hmm.
We go up in the woods in Nevada, like way off the grid. We're, 10,000, 11,000 feet, and we're hunting the whole time. And the whole time I'm up there, I'm freezing cold, right? Every single thing I do takes effort. If we want water, we have to hike down to 5,000 feet, hike it back up. I'm also like bored because there's no cell reception. Sleeping on the ground, hungry the whole time. And I get back from that to my normal life. Now, that was only like 5 days, mind you, but I get back and I just felt a lot better.
Hmm.
And I noticed, like, oh, I was uncomfortable in all these different ways. Long story short, Donnie and I get along. He ends up inviting me on an even bigger trip up to the Arctic for more than a month. I'm like, I wonder what it would be like if I were to join him.
Wow.
And so it was essentially Nevada on steroids. Everything is, way harder. To live was to put in effort to every day. Everything was uncomfortable in every way. But by going through that, and I come back to normal life at home, I'm like 10 pounds lighter, fitter than I'd ever been. And, I already mentioned, like, I'd had to train at some of the world's craziest, most hardcore gyms. And like, this is what really pushed the dial for me. More importantly, I just had a lot more appreciation and gratitude for life. Like, I viewed life completely differently. And I could see that, like, there was this huge difference in environments that I had experienced up there and those that I lived at home, right? It's like when I get home, you can see that life today is super comfortable. Everything is super convenient. We're never challenged. And this is all great. But at the same time, we're never uncomfortable. We're
Hmm.
never challenged, right? And we lived in environments, humans did, much like the one that I lived in the backcountry, and living for like all of time required effort.
Yeah.
And so once we tip into this environment of comfort, like, what's that done to us? What's going on here? So as a journalist, I got a question. And so I go out and investigate it more or less. And so I start traveling the world. I meet with people like researchers at Harvard, doctors at the Mayo Clinic, special forces soldiers, geneticists in Iceland. I go to Bhutan, meet with Buddhist leaders.
Wow.
And these are all people that are kind of showing in their own way that, you know, the way that humans improve is through different kinds of challenges and feeling different kinds of discomfort. So the message of the book is not just, go haphazardly get uncomfortable. It's like there are certain things that we faced as we evolved that, when missing as they are now, if we put them back in our life, we can improve our health, happiness, all that good stuff.
I love that. You must be familiar with the term antifragility.
Yes,
I love that term.
totally.
And just that whole concept that acute challenges, whether it be mental, physical, spiritual, leads to a robustness that wasn't there before.
Yeah.
It strengthens the entirety of the system
Right.
in a way that no pharmaceutical can do, right? Because you
Right.
take a drug and it works on one pathway.
Yes.
Whereas putting yourself in the discomfort of a cold water plunge or sitting in a sauna for a half an hour, I mean, that's like working the entirety of the system in a way that is like completely evolutionarily consistent with what our ancestors had to endure.
Yeah, it's systemic, and and it's across species too. So there's this that made me think of this interesting study where they did it on squirrel monkeys. They took some squirrel monkey babies and they removed them from their parents for, I think it was like 3 months, but they would do these little stints, right? And this really stresses the babies out. So this seems like kind of a messed up study, right? Half the kids were allowed to stay home and cling to their mom. And what they found is that as those squirrel monkeys got older and became adult squirrel monkeys, they were the leaders, they were the doers, they were the badasses.
Wow.
Because they had had this period of stress where they learned something about themselves, learned that, oh, I'm not going to die. Like, I can do, this is fine. When they grow up, they can go out into their normal life and take that with them. And that also applies to humans. It's this concept called toughening, and you see it in research on humans as well, that we do well if we have some sort of challenge in our life, which, in the book, I argue we used to have this often from our environments. This could be from going on a big hunt, or maybe we have to move from summering to wintering grounds, whatever it is. Or we would engineer these into our lives with things like traditional rites of passage, where it's like the elders take the kids and they're like, you're at point A in life. We need to get you to point B. So we're
Hmm.
going to send you out in the wilderness and you're going to do some hard stuff for a while, right? When you come back, you'll have learned something about yourself and grown as a person. And we don't have that anymore. And so this is tied to a lot of the increases in poor mental health outcomes you see, especially among people born after 1990, which is when helicopter parenting really started.
The only rite of passage that I had to endure growing up was a bar mitzvah. And that
Yeah.
was, I mean, that was stressful,
Yeah.
but in a different way, probably not in the kind of way that fosters resilience. What are some of the kinds of stress that we've attenuated due to, the industrialization, the modernization of our present day lifestyles?
Yeah. Well, there's a lot, but I mean, let's start with one that's pertinent to people listening now. We're not bored anymore.
Hmm.
So as we evolved, boredom was this thing, this discomfort that basically told us, hey, whatever you're doing right now, your return on your time invested is running low. So you got to go do something else. So pretend that you and I are out hunting and we haven't seen any animals and the sun is about to set and we don't have food for our family. We would get bored and
Hmm.
boredom would tell us, hey, maybe you should go, dig up some tubers or something. Um, well, nowadays we have this, whenever this, discomfort of boredom kicks in, what do?
Reach for our phones.
Reach for our phones. And, it fixes the problem, but is it really productive? So boredom is really neither good nor bad. But in the past, when boredom would kick in, we were often forced to do productive things. Nowadays, we have really easy, effortless escapes. We have this need to avoid boredom, and we have this really fascinating, amazing tool for avoiding it. So the average person, and in the book, I talk about your brain doesn't really know the difference between the screen on your phone versus the screen on your TV versus the screen on your computer, et cetera. So, I argue we just need to think more boredom instead of less phone because there's not really a difference. We kind of need this time of disconnection, which, one, it gives our brain a rest because we go inward rather than focusing outward. That tends to give us a little more rest. And it also makes us more creative, oddly enough. It sort of tends to spur creativity. So when you look at studies on people who have, been allowed to be stimulated in another group, they'll bore the heck out of them.
Hmm.
The people who have been bored tend to score better on creativity tests because you have this inward time of rest and you're also kind of thinking up weird ideas. And some of them, they're weird. They go nowhere. But sometimes you think of some good stuff.
Yeah, I mean, the ability to let your mind wander is something that my just free association, mind wandering. It's almost becoming a vestigial organ
Yeah.
due to the fact that we've subverted that ability and displaced it with our smartphones. So, what are some ways that um, I mean, do you actively try to foster boredom in your life now?
I do. Yes.
That's fascinating.
Yeah. So, and what got me thinking about this is because when I was in the Arctic, we're up there hunting, and hunting is a lot of waiting. We're waiting for this caribou herd to move through, and we would sit 4 or 5 days just seeing nothing. So we're just sitting on this hill, and obviously my cell phone doesn't work. It's not like I brought a book or anything, and I came up with a lot of ideas from that. So I tried to think, okay, what can I do at home for the same effect? So every day for me, what tends to work is I go for a walk just totally unconnected for at least 20 minutes every single day. And I just use that to sort of be inside my head, to notice what's going on around me. And usually some ideas will kick up. Now, sometimes it's complete nonsense. I'm not going to say that. I talked to a researcher and he's like, boredom is neither good nor bad, just tells you to do something. But that something is increasingly phone or TV. So if that something is like, I got to figure out what that something is inside my head, it can be hopefully something creative. So I do that. And then, I mean, even just looking for opportunities. So I flew in yesterday and the flight's like 45 minutes. I could have, I don't know, been on my phone, watched a movie the whole time. I just sat there with my eyes closed and just kind of like let the wheels turn. because I'm working on some projects right now. And what came out of that was some halfway decent ideas that I
Wow.
wrote down. Yeah. So I think just looking for those little wins. I'm not advocating that people stop using stuff altogether. Like there's amazing stuff on your phones. Phones are amazing, 100%, full stop. But if you're using them, like I teaching at UNLV, I'll take surveys of my students. Some people are on their phones for like 9 hours a day. It's
Wow.
like, that might be too much,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. There was this study where researchers used this really eloquent phrase. They basically said that whenever you have your phone around, it reorients it exerts a gravitational pull on the direction of your attention,
Mm-hmm.
and so I mean, think about all of the incredible moments in life that we are potentially missing or at least not experiencing in their fullest state because we have these like devices around us constantly beckoning us, to engage with them.
Yeah, exactly. Another thing, I mean, and I consciously going outside, I think is important too. In the book, I talk about this idea called the nature pyramid.
Hmm.
And what was interesting is, the Arctic is gnarly, right? Like the weather is crazy. There's grizzly bears. Getting from point A to point B is, I mean, the tundra is very hard to walk on. Let's just say that.
Sounds insane.
Yeah. And so you would think that I would be like just this ball of fear and stress the whole time. Well, the opposite was true, 100%. Like my average level of stress was so low. Like,
Hmm.
of course, when you see a grizzly, you're like, oh my God, and your heart just goes crazy. But overall, it was a lot lower. And so I wanted to learn why that was basically. So I flew to Boston, where there's this neuroscientist named Rachel Hopman, and she's looking at this idea called the nature pyramid, and it basically prescribes it's like the food pyramid, but instead of saying like eat this many grains, eat this many vegetables, eat this much meat, basically says how much time you should spend in nature, what type of nature, and how often. So at the bottom, uh, 3 sessions of 20 minutes once a week per week in the sort of nature you can just find like in a city park tends to bring people's stress levels down, tends to increase their focus. The next level of the pyramid is like 5 hours a month in more, I guess I would say, country nature. So this is like stuff you might find at a state park. Maybe there's a trail, right?
Yeah.
But it's not super hard to get to. That's associated with a lot less depression and just more life satisfaction. And then at the very top is this idea called the 3 day effect. And it basically says after 3 days in nature, your brain starts to ride what are called alpha waves. So these are the same waves they find in experienced meditators, really associated with calmness, increased creativity, just really heightened life satisfaction. And I can tell you that after spending all that time outdoors, totally after day 3 or 4, I mean, you're just like, this is great. And that's stuff that's more backcountry and out there nature. So this is kind of like saying, you should probably do like maybe a backcountry camping trip if you're up for that once a year. And the other catch is that all this stuff gets wiped out if you bring your phone. You spend a bunch of time on your phone
Wow.
outside. So yeah,
Just cancels it out.
yeah,
I mean, that's insane. There was another study that I I read a long time ago, but it was essentially something like, it was like a 3 to 5 day immersion in nature, and they were either, I can't remember if they had prediabetes, they had type 2 diabetes, or if they had quote unquote normal metabolic health. But I remember that there was definitely an increase in insulin sensitivity
hmm,
when they had come back. So it was
yeah,
like no. Well, I guess there was probably going to be a change in their diets, given the fact that they were out of their comfort zone for this bout of immersion into nature, but probably not. It's probably not long enough to see any sort of like needle movement
yeah,
in any of those metrics. But the fact that they were there and the lowering of stress hormones and all that stuff
yeah,
had a profound effect, from what I recall, on their physiology.
yeah, yeah, for sure. And it's funny because when I talk about this, sometimes people are like, I could never go outside for 3 days. It's like, well, that's because you were born in the last 1,000 years, right? If
Right.
you would have been born in another time period, you would be outdoorsy in the sense that you would live outdoors. So I think that sort of the dial has moved so far that we sometimes sell ourselves short with things like that. It's like people don't think they can do a 3 day backpacking trip. And if you really don't want to, the researcher said that you could do like an off the grid cabin, hang out there, but
Hmm.
just so long as you're not spending the whole time like watching TV and on your phone, you're fine.
Are we worse off living in big cities? I mean, I'm from New York City. I live in LA currently. You're from Vegas. Like, what? I mean, what is that doing to our health?
There's this theory called the Savannah theory of happiness. And it basically states that the fewer people you are, the fewer people that are where you are, the happier you'll tend to be as a
Wow.
function of population density. And this is probably because we evolved in pretty small groups of people. So, max about 150 people. And once we get over that, tends to be a little more stressful for us because we have to have like, we have to follow all these laws we make up. We have to remember all these names and faces. It's just a lot of work for the brain. And so when you look at the data, they did this. I think researchers at Harvard did this big survey and of happiness in American cities. And what's the most population dense city in the U.S.? New York.
Is it New York? Yeah.
Which city was dead last? 319 out of 319.
New York?
New York.
Oh, man. For
Yeah,
happiness.
yeah. And when they
Wow.
poll people too, most people say that they would prefer to live in the country or like a small country town.
Hmm.
I think we tend to know that that's like this ideal pace of life for people. Um, but obviously, after the Industrial Revolution, all the jobs moved into cities. And so we follow jobs, even though it's somewhat at odds with our brain, more or less.
So interesting. I mean, that's one of the reasons why I don't think that I would ever live in New York City again. Because I mean, it just LA is so much less dense,
Yes.
and LA is still a pretty dense city. But I tend to be so much happier
Hmm.
when I'm out here.
A lot more. Yeah. I mean, compared to New York, LA is like, country meadows.
Yeah, it is.
A
It is compared to the city.
lot more green, less people. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, it's so interesting. Another area where I think we are definitely suffering is in our disconnection from variation in temperature. And so you spend all this time in the Arctic,
Yeah.
but that I feel like that's a big area, big sort of glaring aspect of modern life that we've
Hmm.
just set on chronic climate control,
Yeah.
which is like you've mentioned, like every area where we've become so comfortable, it's a double-edged sword,
Yes.
right? Because I mean, I love my air conditioning on a hot LA, West Hollywood summer day, but I think the fact that we have access to that all year round and that we utilize it all year round, it's to our detriment in many ways. Can you speak to that?
Yeah. So when we start to change our climates and just we live in 72 degrees now, right? Well, especially when people get cold, like some generally decent things happen to us. It's like our body starts to activate brown fat, which burns white fat to keep us warm. It's like, I think if you're really cold and you shiver, yeah, it's uncomfortable, but your body is essentially just burning energy to sort of like stoke your internal furnace so your organs don't get too cold and you don't die, right?
Hmm.
Um, so it has an effect for calorie burn and general health. But yeah, we don't get that at all really anymore. I mean, I would argue most people, probably the only temperature swings they feel, unless you work outside, which isn't too many people, are like walking from the parking lot at work into the actual office building. And I mean, I think of like, I live in Las Vegas. That city wouldn't exist were it not for climate control,
You're right.
So we don't have times where we are sort of too hot either. And good things can happen there with like heat shock proteins and even like adaptations to just like being better in the heat. It's like when I first, so I was like pretty adapted to this like really warm climate because I work out in my gym and I don't have an air conditioner in there. And then I have to go to the
You
Arctic.
work out, you work out at a gym without air
Oh,
conditioning, or
sorry,
you
in my garage. Yeah, it's
in
a
your
garage
garage?
gym. I forgot the word garage, which is important in that
Wow.
one. But then when I go up to the Arctic, like I was so freezing cold the first like week because I was so used to the heat, and now my body has to like totally do this 180 and switch to cold. But I do think that we've lost some things that can help us with how we don't have to thermoregulate ourselves anymore. And the research on this is, I think sometimes one of the messages of this book is like not no single one of these things that I'm talking about is a silver bullet. And I think the problem, I don't know if it's a problem, but one thing that happens in health is that people look for like the one thing. This is the one thing that's going to do it for me. It doesn't really work like that, right? It's like if you think of how much our lives have changed in the last 100,000, 10,000, 100,000 years, they've changed in so many different ways. So I'm arguing like we need to find these like little wins that add up to a big win. So back to something like temperature, there's a really interesting study where the researchers talk about like, look, lowering your thermostat like in the winter and I think they advocate for like 64 degrees. They thought was a sweet spot. Like that's not going to totally change your life and solve the obesity crisis by helping you sort of thermoregulate and burn more calories, but it is going to help,
Hmm.
right? And so it's like if you can do that, and then can you start to think about how you eat and even how you move? It's like all those things together. Now you're looking pretty good.
Wow. Yeah, you got to make it a lifestyle.
Yeah.
That's so interesting. So talk to me a little bit about brown fat, because people, when they think about the fat on their body, usually people have a very negative association with it,
Yeah.
unfortunately. But I think there needs to be a distinction made between brown fat and white fat, as you mentioned. Can you
Yeah.
can you go into that a little bit?
Yeah. So brown fat is basically just this fat that your body keeps essentially for thermal regulation. That's its job. It's like a little furnace that keeps you warm. And it does that by burning your white fat, which is often a consequence of overeating,
Yeah.
more or less. So we now tend to, because we don't have to thermoregulate, I mean, it's a use it or lose it stuff. It's like your body's not going to keep this expensive stuff on board if it never needs to use it. So we don't have as much of it now, but we do have a lot of white fat, right? So we can spend more time outdoors getting cold or even just in our house. Like, does your house really need to be 72 degrees in December? Or can it be, 62 or whatever it is? Like, you'll survive and you might see some benefit from that.
Yeah. I used to, because I get cold pretty easily.
Mm-hmm.
And I just, being cold is pretty uncomfortable for me. Another reason why I think I moved out of New York. But I would always run for a sweater. But ever since I became familiar with like this line of research, now I embrace it. Like it's been a paradigm shift for me, just in terms of how I think about my own discomfort.
Yeah. Yeah, we do the same. I mean, we don't ever use our furnace in Vegas in the winter. And like granted, it's not getting super cold there in the winter.
What does Vegas get in the winter? Like what's the coldest?
Oh, I
You'll
mean,
see.
overnight it'll go below freezing sometimes,
Oh, wow.
but by the middle of the day it'll be like 60s, 70s. So our house will maybe get at the lowest like in the 50s or something, which is, it's uncomfortably cold, but it's like, we're
Yeah.
fine, So yeah, and we're saving a little bit of energy there too.
Living in LA, sometimes I find there'll be days where I have used in my house both the air conditioning and the heat.
Yeah,
It's a very weird phenomena.
Yeah, you're just chasing from one to the other.
Yeah, just chasing 72.
Yeah,
It's so bad.
yeah, exactly.
And as you mentioned, it costs a lot. When it comes to heat, I mean, heat is like, I'm obsessed with saunas.
Mm-hmm.
Have you done any research into that as a way of sort of like hacking those ancient thermoregulatory mechanisms that are just gathering dust?
I did a tiny bit into that because I talk about in the book how I had to like when I decide I'm going to go to the Arctic, like that's a big jump for me. I was like an Eagle Scout. I'd had to do some interesting stuff for men's health, and I also write for Outside, so like I'd done some outdoor stuff. But more than a month in the Arctic is like we're talking about a different beast. So I had to kind of like overhaul how I exercised, even how I ate, and I just had to learn all this different stuff, right? Like hunting stuff about weather and land, and like emergency wilderness medicine if there's a plane crash or something like that. But one thing, like I said, I would train in my garage, and leading into September, which is when we left, all summer, I was training outside and in the garage a lot. And, it's in the hundreds in Vegas. And there definitely does seem to be some good things that happen when we are exposed to heat, stuff with like heat shock proteins and greater release of the neuroprotector BDNF and just all this different stuff. And I didn't go as deep down that rabbit hole. I kind of mentioned it as an aside, like, hey, here's what happened. This seems good.
Yeah, well, it's important. What kinds of things are you eating when you're in the Arctic? Like you mentioned your diet, I'm sure radically shifted.
Yeah. To answer that succinctly, ultra processed shit.
Oh, really?
Oh yeah. So you think about it, food is heavy, right? So we need to decrease the load we're carrying as much as we can. So how do you do that? It's like we need really light, really calorie dense stuff. And the best thing for that is freeze dried food. So like meals designed for backpacking, where it's like this stuff that's freeze dried. Um, it's got 30-year shelf life. The bag of food maybe has 700 calories, and you just pour boiling water into it. It soaks it up. You let it sit for 10 minutes, and then you have this like mush that maybe tastes like lasagna or chicken teriyaki or whatever it is. But that's basically what we ate for a month. That and like protein bars.
That's insane. Just like whatever you can fit in your backpack.
Yeah. Yeah. You have to keep it light. And so we knew we were going in that we were going to lose weight because we're only eating, I don't know, 2,000 calories a day, burning, I don't know, 3, 4, 5, 6 some days probably. So we definitely lost some weight. Yeah.
Wow.
And, but it's funny because at the end of the day, when you start to get really hungry and start dumping weight, your body really tends to turn up its hunger signals, and like it just wants food. Like you start to obsess about food, and this is shown. I experienced this in the Arctic, but it's also been shown in studies as far back as like the 50s. So if you, there's a study called the Minnesota starvation experiment. They did this thing where they starved these guys for, I think it was 6 months, because they wanted to learn. This was at the end of World War II. It's like, how do we help starving people? What happens to people when they starve? Because more people, about as many people in Europe were dying from starvation as they were from the actual war itself in Europe and from battle. So American researchers wanted to know, what happens to a starving body? How do we bring it back? And they basically found that like all these crazy mechanisms kick in that keep us alive. And one of them is that we start to like obsess about food. Your brain like just all you think about is food and how to get it and what you're going to eat and weird combos. So when we would sit down to those meals that are objectively terrible in any other setting, just like, oh my God, man, this lasagna mush, this is delicious tonight,
Wow, I can't even imagine. Are they like custom made to be like stuffed in a backpack and brought on an excursion like that? Or
Yeah, there's a few different companies that make them. The company that we were using is called Mountain House, and you can buy them at like REI and places like that. But yeah, I think they're max maybe 600 to 900 calories, and there's all these different like meals they have that somewhat resemble the thing they're actually shooting for.
Yeah, that's so interesting.
Yeah.
What are you trying to get? Are you like actually thinking about exercise when you're out, with that kind of calorie burn on a daily basis, or is the journey exercise enough?
Oh, the journey's exercise enough.
Yeah.
You start to go, you start to approach exercise, I think, like humans did for nearly all of time, in the sense that you don't move unless you have to. Right. So there's a reason that exercise sucks today. It's because for all of time, when resources were scarce, evolving in these environments of scarcity, if you have a limited supply of food, why would you ever move more than you needed to and thereby burn more calories and put yourself in a position where you could die, right? We are adapted to try and be as lazy as possible. Now, our environments in the past, tough. You couldn't be lazy. So we were forced into quote unquote exercise, which was not exercise then. It was life, right? Exercise is something we invented 150 years ago, when all of a sudden people started sitting behind desks, jobs became more sedentary, and we go, why are people getting heart disease? What's with this thing? It's this new thing. What's going on? Oh, maybe it's because we're not moving anymore. Oh, okay, let's invent this thing so we have to move again, right? So in the Arctic, I'm more back in that original state where it's like, I'm not moving unless I have to, because it's only going to make me more hungry. I'm going to lose more weight, be more miserable. Now, of course, I was forced into movement like all the time.
Yeah,
So,
it is interesting. Exercise is like a supplement these days.
Yeah, it's to offset our environments that we've built. And look, and so this is one reason why I think in the fitness world, a lot of times there's like judgment can be passed if people don't want to exercise. It's like, oh, well, why don't you want to exercise? People are made to feel bad about it. Let me tell you something. If you're a person who likes to exercise, like I am, to be honest, you are one of the weird ones in the grand scheme of time and space, right? Like you're the weird one because we have these like, there's a reason people don't want to be exercise. There's 2.5 million years of evolution telling you, oh, dude, sit on the couch and eat Fritos. Like that's so much easier. And why is that? It's because that behavior would have saved us in the past so we could live on and spread our DNA.
Dude, I love that. I'm right there with you, flying the freak flag. I love certain kinds of exercise,
Yeah.
but it totally, you're 100% right. That's why it's so hard for people, especially people who have been chronically sedentary for an extended period of time, to start a new workout regimen.
Mm-hmm.
Did you look into exercise and, as one of these forms of stressors, that, that has potentially broad health, benefiting effects?
Oh, totally. So, I mean, exercise is honestly the best thing you can do to avoid chronic disease. Like chronic diseases are really a function of how little we now move and how much we now eat. And you go down all the list of stuff that kills people today. Heart disease and stroke are number one. Cancer is number two. I think accidents are actually number three. It could be lung disease. Lung disease and accidents I think are three and four. Even if you get in a car wreck, you're more likely to live if you're fit. Fitness is the number one thing that can help you avoid all these things. And, because we're trying to figure out, okay, how do I get it back? I know it's good for me. I don't really want to do it. How do I get it back in my life? We've essentially thought, okay, like I'm just going to try and make exercise as comfortable as possible. I'm going to go in this climate controlled gym. I'm going to self select how many reps and sets of what weight I'm going to use. And I'm going to do this movement, this like padded thing on this like fixed movement plane. I'm going to go on an elliptical. I'm only going to do it for 20 minutes because I don't want to do more than that. Right. So now this is, of course, good, but it's very different than we had in the past. And we also know that like even just hitting the most basic government guidelines makes you way less at risk of all these different diseases that kill us now. So like for example, a lot of the result of our lack of fitness, things like obesity, can take up to 13 years off your life, which is even more than smoking.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's crazy. So if you want to live to 100, what do you do?
You don't eat too much, you exercise, and you have good genes.
And you have good genes.
Yeah. I think so.
Yeah, I mean, genes do still play a role.
Yeah. So in the book, though, I talk about what I think is an interesting form of exercise that was totally lost is you look at the way the human body is built with like we walk upright, we sweat, we're really good at thermoregulating. We're pretty athletically pathetic compared to other animals. So we're like slow sprinters, right? Really slow. We're not that strong, but we are really good at running long distances slowly in the heat, especially. So other animals can't cool themselves. So we would use this to our advantage to hunt. So we evolved.
Wow.
We would like slowly but surely chase animals down. Eventually, the animal would topple over from heat exhaustion. We'd spear it and we'd carry it back home. This could occur over 5, 10, 15 miles. So a lot of people still run, right? But the second part of that is carrying is what else makes us really unique among animals. We're the only animal that can carry for distances, right?
Fascinating.
So we can pick, we would cut up the animal, have the meat, and then we'd hoof it back home. Now, a lot of people still run, but how many people for a workout pick up something heavy and just carry it?
Very few. I mean, I don't know anybody who does that.
Yeah, very few. So I found this group of people who still do this, and this is special forces soldiers. So the idea of rucking, where you have a backpack and you put weight in it, that's the foundation of their training. So when people watch, special forces training videos, it's like they show them doing burpees in the ocean and getting yelled at. That's a very small amount of their training. Most of it is based around rucking, just marching with a lot of weight in your pack because that's what they have to do in war the most. And it turns out that is amazing for us for two reasons. It has the same basic cardio benefits of running, and it also adds an element of strength. And we also know from the research that strength exercise is important. So a lot of I think only 20% of people hit both the cardiovascular and strength guidelines from the government. So 1 in 5. So this sort of gives you you kill two birds with one stone. I went and I met this guy who's a former Green Beret, started this company called GoRuck. And they're basically they're trying to put rucking at scale for the average person. So they sell these really cool backpacks. and do all these rucking events, etc. And he calls it lifting for people who hate the gym and cardio for people who hate to run. And it's got a lot lower injury risk. And so, in the book, I talk about how important carrying was to our evolution, why it's so good for us, and sort of how to get it back into your life.
That is fascinating. And I've heard of rucking, but only because I went to your Instagram and I saw
Yeah.
you post about it.
Yeah.
Some days ago when I was, doing some research on you prior to this interview. But what a fascinating concept, rucking.
Yeah.
So how do you do it? I mean, there's these companies now that they make like ruck packs and things
Yeah.
like that.
So, like, I want to take down people's barrier to entries to do this. Just get any old backpack you have to start, put like 20 pounds in it. It should be able to hold up to that. Walk. Like, that's how simple it is.
That's it.
Yeah. And it burns 2 to 3 calories, 2 to 3 times as many calories as just walking alone. You can go up to like 50 pounds. Once you get over 50, the injury risk climbs a little bit. So I generally suggest like stay 50 or below. Um, my wife generally makes fun of all my weird exercise stuff, but I even sold her on rucking.
Wow.
So it's cool because we'll ruck together. So it's like it's harder than walking, right? But it's also like she carries 20 pounds, I carry 35. We can go at the same speed, we can talk, but it's also a lot better for us than walking.
So you're carrying it like you can put it in a backpack.
Yeah.
And I think it makes sense to limit the weight to some degree because I mean, it's still compressive force on your spine, right?
Yeah, but what's interesting is that because people slump over their desks so often, a lot of people are in this sort of position like this. I'm exaggerating it. And when you put weight on their back, all of a sudden it pulls them
Wow.
into a straighter spine. So it can actually be good for your spine. It actually can help prevent and relieve back pain. And that's coming from a guy whose name is Stu McGill, and he's like the world's foremost expert on back health. It's something that he generally recommends for most people.
That's fascinating. So aside from carrying the weight on your back, do you and your wife also hold things in your hands?
I will in my workouts. So
Hmm.
I do, I will ruck. I ruck often. Like if I'm just going to go for a walk with the dogs, it's like, it's not that big of a deal to just throw a pack on and Go Ruck sells packs that can hold more than you would ever be able to carry in them. They also do like ruck plate carriers and stuff. But yeah, I'll just take a pack for something like that. But then in my workouts, just thinking about how carrying is so important tends to really like stabilize your spine. And it's amazing for the core because a lot of core exercises we do, things like planks, right? They're very stationary. But when you look at how athletes move, like the foundation for athletic movement is being able to lock down your core and move your limbs. So think of how a pitcher throws the ball. It's like core totally stiff, and then you're generating a lot of power off of that and sending it up to your extremities. So a way to train that is basically by doing things like um, suitcase carries in the gym that are heavy, farmers carries in the gym. Just like pick stuff up and carry it and walk with it. Like it's so simple, but it's like this thing that our body has evolved to do, and it tends to have a lot of benefits.
I love that. I've been waiting for Go Ruck to stock back up on their training vests.
Oh yeah,
Yeah, they've been out of stock for a while because I heard about the company from you and then I was going to go buy a pack and they're out of stock. But I thought how cool it would be to wear one while while walking, but also B, while doing other workout
totally,
stuff, like while boxing. I enjoy boxing
totally.
or how awesome that would be. If you think about it, like all of the world's like blue zones, the people that are like long-lived people, probably this is probably one of those variables that is contributing to the long life
Mm-hmm.
observed in people that live in the quote unquote blue zones, right? That they carry stuff. They're not like loading up their trunks,
Yeah,
and just absolving themselves of any kind of like, you know, weight bearing stress.
yeah. Like, look, I like running's great, but people don't run if you don't really have to, right?
I hate running.
Yeah, I think a lot of people do.
Yeah.
Um, I think you do see a lot more carrying in the real world. Like, I've done a lot of traveling to sort of more developing nations, and you see that happen all the time. And like, I was in Bhutan, and you see women who are like, I'm looking at them, I'm like, you're either 70 or 170. I'm not sure, but they're carrying just like huge loads on their back of like, a bunch of twigs or whatever it might be. and they're still strong, vital. And you look at a lot of hunter-gatherer tribes, still, I mean, you think hunting and gathering, what do you do with your gathered stuff? You're carrying it the whole time,
Yeah.
right? It's like it's this thing, and we don't do it anymore.
We don't.
Yeah.
This is amazing. So wait, what are some really practical ways to integrate rucking into your life? If it really is one of the keys to living a long time, I mean, would you say like just put some books in a backpack, go, walk to the local store, like shop, this way you're carrying weight on your backpack. Maybe you carry some groceries home with you.
Totally.
That sounds like a good prescription.
Yeah. I mean, when I was training for the Arctic, because I'm thinking, all right, I'm going to have pretty heavy pack on my back the entire time. I got to get used to just extended time with my pack. I mean, I would clean the freaking house with a 50,
Whoa.
60-pound pack on. And like, it's actually not that bad. I mean, you get used to it and it's like, all right, yeah. And you start to like, you just feel solid.
Dude, I love this. I already do enough weird stuff, but I'm going to start wearing a weighted backpack while I do chores around the
Oh,
house.
man.
It's going to be
Make it
awesome.
weirder.
Yeah. Dude, this is so cool. Rucking. It's awesome. Was there anything that surprised you over the course of writing the book? Any aspects, any areas where you immersed yourself, found it was too uncomfortable, and then had to back out?
Had to back out. I'm trying to think. Okay, so I think the way to answer this is that so the guy I go up there with is a backcountry hunter, right? And I was not planning on hunting because I'm like, I'm a journalist. I don't want to get too embedded in the story. Because he asked me, he's like, yeah, you should hunt. And I'm like, yeah, no. And he goes, and then he told me, he's like, I think you'd really understand why we come up here a lot better if you were to hunt. And so I decided to. And I didn't want to, I think, not only I mean, I think I was kind of telling myself the journalist thing, but like, look, I eat meat. I always have, but like, I didn't really want to cross that barrier, that emotional barrier, you know? But I trusted this dude. I decided that I was going to hunt. I mean, I bought a hunting license and I was up there to hunt, but I still wasn't sure if I was actually going to do it when the opportunity arose. And the opportunity did arise. I mean, we'd been, searching for caribou for a while and finally got in a position where, I was going to hunt. And like, even as these caribou cross this like apex of this sort of summit and they start coming down, and there's one that is very old. So we're generally trying to hunt the older species because if you kill one of those, it generally impacts the health of the herd in a positive way. Older ones tend to be bullies. They tend to like take all the women. Like it's,
Wow.
It's not great for the herd. And so we see this older one who also has a limp. So he's clearly not going to make it through the winter. So this was like the animal. And they got to a point where they were maybe 150 yards away. I was still kind of hesitating because I couldn't really get a good shot. And the dude I was with was just like, hey, man, if you don't want to pull the trigger, you don't have to. But if you're going to pull the trigger, you got to do it now. And pull the trigger. And my initial reaction was like, oh my God, like, what have you done? Like, there's no coming back from this, right? Like, this is heavy. We get to the animal, and I was pretty regretful. But once we started to break the animal down, field dress it, my mind sort of shifted because all of a sudden I can see that, oh, it's meat that I'm going to eat. And then the question arises, you eat meat all the time, dude, like all the time. And never once have you felt any iota of emotion eating that meat. So what is it about this, And so that's a hard question to ask yourself. And I think it changed my relationship with meat. I still eat meat, but you would think as someone, starts hunting, they would eat more meat. But the opposite has been true for me because I'm kind of forced to realize that there is this heavy emotional barrier that comes along with that, by putting yourself in that life cycle. And frankly, I'm glad that I did it, like a lot of things in this book, it's like, you got to go through some discomfort to learn some truths that can improve your life.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I've never hunted, and I'm a, habitual meat consumer, and I don't know if I'd be able to do it, but I think it is one of these like important rites of passage.
Yeah.
Yeah, to be able to have some kind of connection to where the food comes from, and to viscerally experience the fact that, it's not grown on trees.
Yeah.
It comes from an animal that had a whole um universe of experience.
Yeah, totally. And it sort of got me. So that sort of story in the book, it like leads into this, what I went to Bhutan for. So it kind of, once you realize that, like, oh, for one thing to live on, i.e., me, another thing has to die, right? It also got me thinking about my own mortality. So I traveled to Bhutan because they look at death a lot differently than we do in the US. You brought up how meat just sort of kind of appears, it's like we are totally removed from the life cycle. Like at the grocery store, meat is like perfectly manicured. There's no sense that it came from a living animal. Even our funeral system is, you know, make the person look as alive as possible after they've died, look at them for an hour, and then we're told, keep your mind off it. Well, in Bhutan, death is really woven into the culture. People are told to think about their death at least once a day. There's all these reminders of death in things like art and cultural stories. And there's even these things all over the country called sasas. And they're these clay pyramids that are mixed with clay and ashes of the dead. And when I say they're everywhere, I mean like every windowsill has a bunch of, they're just everywhere in the country. So it's
Wow.
this constant reminder. And I met with this guy who's a lama in Buddhism, which really high up. And, he talked to me about how this idea of impermanence, and how when you sort of take into your mind that one day you're going to die, although it is uncomfortable, that is an uncomfortable thought, right? You tend to come out on the other side happier and better for it, because it alters your behavior in such a way that you make better decisions. So it's like, if I realize this ride is going to end and I remind myself of that, I'm probably not going to get worked up about a lot of the meaningless BS that people tend to get worked up about every day, right? It's like you focus more on that which matters to you. And Bhutan is a really interesting case study because, in the US, it's like, what makes you happy? It's like that American dream, right? It's like we get a lot of stuff, you get married, you have kids, you go to school, you get a house, you get a car, you get a bigger house, you get a bigger car, right? It's like kind
Yeah.
of this narrative. But Bhutan is one of the least developed nations on earth, like in terms of how the UN measures it. But they're also one of the happiest. Like there's not a single stoplight in the entire country.
Wow.
There's no like chains or anything. But they consistently rank in the top 20 in happiness in the world. So it's like, wait a minute.
Yeah.
If money makes us happy, what's going on over there?
Yeah.
Right. So they've taken like a total sort of shift and really figured out like, okay, what's going to make our people happy? How do we invest in that rather than chasing this idea of like growing in GDP? Because that often takes resources and people tend to want more stuff. So like sort of looking for those bigger things, and realizing that this ride is going to end is, I think, part of that for them.
Has there, since you discovered this, have you done anything that helps you maybe ponder your mortality on a daily basis? Like, I mean, what can be done, with that?
Yeah,
What can we take from that?
yeah, and this sounds like, I think it sounds sort of like morbid. I think, but that's a cultural thing. But I mean, I just like every night as I go to bed, think about, okay, you're going to die one day. What does that mean? Like, what does that mean? What are you going to do about it? Well, I can't really do anything about it, right? So what am I going to do with this blip of time that I have? How am I going to spend that? What really matters to me? I think what it does is it forces you to make decisions that are more likely to make you happy.
Hmm. Gratitude practice, I feel like, can also help.
Oh, totally.
Um, taking notes, on a daily, weekly basis, checking in, doing an inventory, all the things that you're
Hmm.
grateful for.
Yeah.
Um, I do that occasionally. I think it's very helpful.
Yeah.
Um, Dude, well, this is fascinating. What a cool journey. And the fact that this is your first book, it's so exciting. Has it been a good experience for you so far?
Yeah. It's been super fun. Super fun. Yeah. I mean, get to talk to cool people like you, get some nice messages from readers. A lot of
Ooh.
people I've been getting a lot of people who've reached out who started like rucking and it's helped them lose weight, or they've done the sort of death practice thing and they're like, whoa, dude, I changed a lot about my life after I started, weaving that into it. More people spending more time outside because of it.
Hmm.
Yeah, I think that's kind of really why you do it,
Yeah, it's so important, especially with the crazy mental health statistics today.
Oh, yeah.
So many people are suffering. That there's a non-pharmacologic potential antidote out there for people.
Yeah.
But it's as you mentioned, people want the quick fix. They want
Right.
the magic bullet. Not everybody, but I think it's tempting. And it's not. I don't think it's due to a moral failure that those who want those quick fixes have. I think it's because we're being sold that constantly from, whether it's pharmaceutical ads on TV,
Mm-hmm.
Eat whatever crap you want, take this pill and the heartburn will go away.
Right.
It's like we're being sold that in so many aspects of life
Totally.
that's what I think people have come to expect when it comes to their health.
I think so as well. And I think it's like, look, human wiring is to do the easier thing that kept us alive for all of time. So if I'm looking at 2 hours of rucking or even a half hour rucking, and what about that pill? The pill looks decent, right?
Yeah.
Now we know that pills maybe work until they don't, whereas something that takes a little more effort and is in more alignment of how we evolved to what you said earlier, like it's going to have a lot more systemic effects and they're going to be more long lasting. And yeah, it's going to be uncomfortable in the short term, but like in the long term, you're going to be way better off. It's like you got to go through some of those discomforts to get really where you want to be, I think.
Hey guys, if you enjoyed that conversation, you're going to love this one.
So why do people and how do people behave the way they behave? And really, quite honestly, how do people just excel? And I grew up in Connecticut. I was an average kid. I was an average student. I was an average athlete. I mean, I didn't have any real trauma or real distinctive stories that could add to my narrative as, oh, this is why he became a Navy SEAL. There's nothing like that. I was just a normal kid. Yet, and then when I went through SEAL training, I made it through and I found myself staring at people who, man, I'm surrounded by superheroes here. How did I get here? Right. What was interesting to me is most of the guys thought that way. They'd look around and was like, I'm surrounded by superheroes, but we all felt distinguished. We all felt pretty average. Like there's nothing special about us is how we all felt. Most SEALs will say that, there's nothing really special. We just figured out a way to capitalize on our strengths. And so this is when I began to really think about attributes. When I got out of the military and I was interested in human performance, I started talking about high performing teams. I kept on getting asked, hey, Rich, we just put together this dream team. Got the top sales guy, the top graphics designer, top whatever, right? They were awesome until things went sideways and the team just went toxic. They fell apart. And they said, why does that happen? I said, because you were looking at the wrong things. You were putting together your team based on skills when you really needed to put your team together based on attributes, because attributes will tell us how we perform, both in normal times in a hidden way, but certainly when things go south. And so what I did was for the book, I basically took the attributes that I had explored in the SEAL teams, tried to ubiquitize them, right? Because some of them don't apply in normal life like they do in the SEAL teams, and then put them in the categories. What are the grit attributes? What are the mental acuity attributes? What are the drive attributes? What are the ones that make up great leadership? And what are the ones that make up great team ability? And came up with 25. And again, that's not an exhaustive list. There are a lot more than 25. But,
there are more than 25?
Well, I talk about 25, but there are more than 25 attributes that exist. So
it's fascinating.
yeah.
And I love how you've categorized them by 5 sort of umbrella categories. You've got attributes that are indicative of grit, attributes that are indicative of mental acuity, the drive that one has. I love that. But one thing that I just want to clarify. So attributes, you said skills you can learn over time. You have the capacity to develop and improve upon your skill set. Attributes you're to a certain degree you're born with. Are you suggesting that they're immutable, that we can't develop attributes that we aren't born with, that we can't improve upon the attributes that we might already exhibit?
Right. I am absolutely not suggesting that. We can actually
Great. That's good news.
yeah, we can totally improve. The difference is you can't do it the same way you can learn a skill. An attribute has to be developed. It has to be first of all, you have to be self motivated. It has to be self directed, and you also have to kind of decide to consciously put yourself into environments of discomfort so that you may test and develop that attribute. So if you are, for example, an inherently impatient person and you want to develop your patience, well, I can't sit down and teach you a class on how to be patient. It's not going to work. You have to decide, I want to learn my patience. I want to develop my patience. Then you have to put yourself into environments that test your patience,
Mm.
right? So it goes with any attribute. If you want to be more adaptable, if you want to be more resilient, if you want to be more disciplined, whatever it is, you have to do it yourself. But they can be developed. Um, yeah, they're not immutable, but it's your decision. There are some attributes you may not need to or want to develop, depending on your role in life, depending on what you're doing. I mean, I have leadership attributes. Not everybody is really a leader per se. I mean, we all have relationships, but maybe you're a comedian, right? That's not really. It's kind of a self-directed profession, right? So you don't need to be a leader per se, or a great teammate. So there's some of those that you might not need to develop. It's really up to the individual.
I love that. So how did you then adapt these attributes that you identified in your, among your team members, and then sort of extrapolate out so that people from all different professions could basically benefit from them?
Well, I first thing I did was, when we did it for the team, we came up with 36. So the first thing I did was I looked at that list and said, okay, based on what I know now, which ones are more skilly than
Yeah.
they are attributey. So I took out those, and then I looked at, there were some that were distinctly designed for, I would say, good for SEAL team uh, uh, action, right? I mean, so each team, depending on
Was bloodlust one of the ones that
that was
didn't
not, yeah,
make the cut?
I didn't explore that one. But honestly, if someone had bloodlust, I would probably deselect them because there needs to be that's a little bit too far. You need to, so the warrior profession, is something that I think, well, most of us think has to be taken very seriously. When you are really endowed with to put it bluntly, permission to take life, that is a responsibility that's very weighty, and if you don't consider that, and if you don't have the right mentality around that, you have problems. Some of those problems we've seen played out, because some of it becomes public, and we're like, yeah, that's a problem, right? When you're in war, you have to really be cognizant of that. And I think choosing the right people, and I think the selection process, whether it be SEAL selection process or any selection process, but the SEAL one is the one I'm most familiar with. I think they've done a great job, and they continue to do great work in trying to codify and understand what are those attributes you're looking for, and bloodlust certainly would not be one of them, right? So
That's really funny. I can already tell which ones have been beneficial to me as a sort of media entrepreneur author. Definitely grit. And we can sort of break these apart, which I love that you do in the book. I mean, it's so cool the way that you've organized this. But courage, perseverance, adaptability, resilience. Um, I mean, these are all so important, especially today, especially in the year 2020. If there's anything that 2020 has proven us, is that shit can go sideways real quick.
that's right. That's
Yeah.
right.
And
Yeah.
you need to have some degree of grit.
Yeah, you do. Grit is inherently human, and one of the things that was interesting for me in studying grit was that a lot of people think of grit as an attribute, and it's really not. It's not just one thing. It's a combination of things. And Angela Duckworth did a book on grit, which is a really good book, and she said kind of the same thing. It's a combination of different things that make up grit. I certainly took the optic from, okay, what are the attributes that make up grit, and tried to simplify and make it pretty elemental. But courage, I mean, courage is, so courage is interesting. It was a fascinating one for me, courage, because, that's, our mutual friend, Andrew Huberman, and I worked on this a lot together, because he studies it in the lab and I kind of experienced it in the field.
Hmm.
Right. But the idea of what courage is that it is basically the ability to move into fear. Well, okay, what does that mean? Well, now we have to understand what fear is. Well, fear is actually interesting. Fear is actually the combination of two things. It's a combination of uncertainty plus anxiety, right? If you think about these two things in their singular versions, right? You can have anxiety without uncertainty. That's, I don't know, I'm nervous to do this podcast, right? But I'm not uncertain about it, right? I'm just, have some anxious, or I'm nervous to give a presentation at work. That's anxiety without uncertainty. Uncertainty without anxiety, well, that's every kid on Christmas Eve, right?
Mhm.
You combine the two and you begin to get fear, right? So
Mm.
if you have both anxiety and uncertainty, that's when fear starts to emerge. Fear is in many ways a kind of an elemental unconscious response. It's your autonomic nervous system starting to ramp up, in some cases taking over, right? But you're certainly starting to teeter into the fight or flight response. Now the freeze response is in there too, but really scientifically what they've seen is the freeze response is really just a rapid oscillation between fight, or you're kind of trying to decide
Yeah.
between both, right?
Whether to fight or
Whether,
flee.
whether fight or flight. So what's interesting about the neuroscience around this is that they've discovered circuits that actually switch on with each of those responses. So if you fight, a certain circuit switches. If you flight, if you you flee, a certain circuit turns on. That circuit that turns on when you fight, and by fight we mean move into fear. It's not put up your dukes, right? Um, when you fight and that circuit goes, that's the courage switch. That's the courage circuit. You are switching on the courage circuit. And you're moving into your fear. Once you do that, you actually get a hit of dopamine. You get rewarded because from an evolutionary perspective, we had to do this. Humans had to be encouraged to move out, to move on, to explore, to discover, find berries, find food, whatever. So we needed a system in our physiology that encouraged us to do this. So that's dopamine, right? So when we decide to move into our fear, we get a dopamine response. We are all predisposed with kind of a certain level at which our fear begins to set in, our autonomic response begins to kick in. If most of us are at like boiling point, like 212, right? We all know people who get afraid a lot faster, right? Maybe their boiling point is like 190, right? So they get afraid fast. There are other people who get afraid. It takes them a while, right? They
Mm.
maybe at 230. This is like the Alex Honnold free solo, right? Where it takes a while to kick on that switch. Um, but the idea is once it kicks on, so that would indicate our level of courage as an attribute. The good news is we can decide to move into it, and when we move in, we get rewarded. The key thing about courage is that it cannot exist in the absence of fear. Fear has to be part of it. So, me, who's, and I talk about in the book being afraid of heights. I don't like heights, and so skydiving was always a challenge for me, but every time I moved into that, I'd get rewarded and it encouraged me to do it. So we can actually work on that and move through it and train ourselves to move through fear. The I would maintain, I don't want to speak, exclusively here or for the group, but I would maintain that one of the most powerful qualities of Navy SEALs or spec operators or even military folks is that not that they're fearless. It's that we've all designed our systems. We've practiced moving into fear habitually. We understand how to do it, and when we have to do it, we do it. And that's really the power behind a lot of people of service, whether it's a firefighter, a police officer, a surgeon or a nurse who are fighting the COVID battle. I mean, these are people who are consistently moving into fear,
Mm.
and that's both admirable, but also for me fascinating, you know. And so a lot of us had to actually work on our courage during 2020. But as an attribute, as a grit attribute, it's the first step, I think, in grit and the ability to kind of move into stress, anxiety, challenge.
I love that. I mean, few people listening to this are faced with physical danger,
Mhm.
on a day-to-day basis, the way that you and your teammates are. But is this essentially like a biological imperative to basically lean into parts of our life that evoke fear,
Yeah, fear and stress, right?
fear and stress?
Stress by design causes us to take action. When we're hungry, our body starts feeling stressed, right? So that's our body saying, "Go get food." When we're lonely, our body feels stressed. That's our body saying, "Go find, companionship," right? So we've been designed naturally to move into yeah, well, we've been designed naturally for stress to cause us to move, right? And then we've also been designed so that when stress turns into fear, we're rewarded when we keep moving. Now,
Mm.
again, it's not the reward when we necessarily get to the objective. It's taking every step, right? Every step we move, we get a reward. So we don't have to wait until we find the food at the other side of the mountain or whatever, or find the mate, right? Every step towards that. If you, the lonely guy who goes and talks to the girl in the supermarket who he finds attractive, he's going to get rewarded, at least from dopamine. He may not, he may not get rewarded by a phone number, but
Right.
you know, But that's
Story of my life.
yeah. But doing that, doing the action is a positive step, and it's evolutionary. It's designed by evolution.
I love that. My mother growing up always applauded courage in my house,
Yeah.
whether it was taking a test or going in for a medical procedure or getting a dental filling or something like that. She always identified when either me or my two younger brothers were exhibiting courage, and she would praise us
Yeah.
for that.
Yeah.
And I definitely credit her. I mean, regular listeners of my podcast, people who know my work know that, much of my work has been not just motivated by her, but it's been sort of just a constant practice of like, moving into areas where it's sort of been uncomfortable for me,
Yeah.
and I've just sort of like went in that direction.
Yeah, and it's uncertain, right? I mean, uncertainty typically is going to come with anxiety. Human beings don't like uncertainty. Again, Christmas Eve is just one example where it doesn't, anxiety might not be additive to that. But typically when you're moving into uncertainty, there's anxiety with that. And so yeah, if we set up an environment where we're adding to the rewards of moving in. One of the best pieces of advice, and I named it, it became the name of the first chapter, the courage chapter. One of the best pieces of advice a senior officer once told me was to beware the fearless leader,
Hmm.
because he'll likely get you killed, right?
Wow.
Because if you have a leader who shows no fear, then that person is not effectively managing risk, because fear is designed to make us stop, make us think, make us contemplate, and decide to either move into it or flee. Sometimes flee is the right answer. Don't get me wrong. Sometimes it is. We're not supposed to fight a bear, but yeah, that's you have to. Anybody well, I would maintain anybody who purports to be fearless is lying. But if you actually see that type of behavior, I'd probably keep a distance.
There was that amazing scene in one of my favorite movies of all time, The Dark Knight Rises. I'm a huge
Yes.
fan of the Dark Knight trilogy. It's
Yeah.
like one of my favorite. I mean, I just like obsessed. And when Bruce Wayne is stuck in the pit in wherever on Earth that pit happens to be, Bane puts him there after he breaks his back. The prisoner who he's imprisoned with, his prison mate,
hmm
is asking him like, when he's going to take the leap, when he's going to like try to get out of the thing. And Bruce Wayne keeps saying that he's like not afraid of death. He has no fear of death. And his prison mate says, well, that's your problem.
Right.
You have to fear death, and then you
Yeah.
have to harness that fear.
Yeah. Yeah. Some of the best music. So by the way, I listened to that specific soundtrack. That it's that part. So I think it's called The Climb, or
Yeah,
Why Do We Fall? It's
Yes.
the music, right? It's beautiful because it's like, it's just that's exactly it. You need, we are designed to fight faster, to move stronger, to survive if we have fear. If you have no fear, that's dangerous. So
Yeah, you need fear.
Yeah.
I love the mental acuity section. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
yes, so mental acuity was probably the one that I focused on the most when I was running the SEAL training piece, because again, we were dealing with guys who were very experienced, and we were putting them through training scenarios. And when one particular one is close quarter combat, which is really the act of clearing a room or building. So you run into a building, you have to clear it. Either you're finding someone you have to grab or save, but the idea is you have to go room by room. Police officers do that when they have to go and take down a house or find a bad guy. But that's the sequence of close quarter combats, or CQC, is actually very dynamic and very uh, unpredictable. In other words, it's constantly changing, right? No no run is kind of no run is ever the same, and it's all a matter of you as an individual adjusting rapidly to your teammates in a very dynamic, and in the case of live fire, could be deadly, scenario or environment. And so mental acuity attributes became really something I focused on, because it's really about how the brain works and how the brain processes our environment. So it's four of them. It starts with situational awareness. So how aware are we of everything that's coming in? So we get 11 million bits of information a second.
A
through all-
second.
Yeah, through all of our senses, right? And that's all five. I guess six if we if we want to get a little bit more into it. But our logical, our frontal lobe really only processes I think 2,500 or 3,000 of that, right? So
Hmm.
so there's a lot happening that we're not noticing. Well, excuse me, we're we're noticing, our senses are noticing, but we're not putting attention to it. Like, you can say that, right now you're not noticing the bottom of your feet in your shoes, right? Until I just told you. Now you're
Right.
noticing it, right?
Now
So,
I am.
but for a while there we weren't, right? So situation awareness is your ability to take in that information and actively say process it in the ways, okay, I noticed this, I noticed that. In a word, it's kind of vigilance. So higher vigilant people or hyper vigilant people will notice a lot of things. I was always this way, but I've certainly hyper developed this in my career. Right, I'm the type of person who, when I walk down a street in New York City, I'm noticing people, I'm noticing their hands, I'm noticing dark alleys, I'm noticing doorways, I'm noticing traffic coming at me. Right, I'm noticing a lot of things. You can be overly vigilant, that's too much, that becomes stressful, right? But situational awareness in short is your ability to take in information. Once you take in that information, you now have to compartmentalize it to effectively operate. And that's based on, okay, what is my objective at this moment? And what in this mass of incoming information can I use to effectively achieve my objective? So this would be, I kind of use this example in the book, but this would be, I'm at an airport and I'm late for my flight, okay? And I'm running through the gates, right? There's a lot of information around me, right? I can see the Chili's, I can see the bathrooms, I can see the board, I can see the gate numbers. Out of everything that I can see, everything I'm taking in, I can hear the announcement, right? Everything I'm taking in. What do I need to focus on right now? Well, I need to focus on finding my gate, right? So compartmentalization is immediately taking it in, assessing it, prioritizing it. Okay, out of everything I'm just noticing, I don't need to know about the Chili's. I don't need to know about the bathrooms. I don't need to know about the flight board, because that's, I have to find my way in there anyway. What I'm going to focus on is the gate signs, right? So
Mhm.
assessing, prioritizing. Okay, I'm gonna focus on the gate size, and then focusing. Now I'm gonna focus on this and move towards. That is compartmentalization. Now that's kind of buttressed and assisted by task switching, which is kind of the next phase. Task switching is our ability to come out of one focus and into another. So this happens all the time naturally, right? If you're driving a car and you park it and you, so let me back up. Inside of certain contexts, there's task switching. So while we're driving a car, we're task switching, right? I'm focusing on the road at one point. I'm pushing the brake. I might be playing with the radio. Hopefully, I'm not on my phone, right? I'm
Hopefully.
putting my blinker on. That you're task switching within a context. Then you have task switching outside context, right? I park the car. I'm walking into the supermarket, right? Well, now I'm task switched I'm walking in a parking lot, which takes another set of vigilance, right? Another set of prioritization, because I got to look at parked cars or moving cars. Then I move into the supermarket, and now it switches again, right? So that's task switching. So our ability to task switch effectively speaks to our level of task switching as an attribute. We of course all have it. Some of us are better at it, and some of us are not so good at it. Some people, you might be someone who, when you get focused into something, very hard for you to switch your attention, really hard to come out and switch.
Yeah.
Um, Other people switch too fast, right?
Hmm.
This might be attention deficit could be like the far end of this, where it's like constant switching. You can't focus on anything, right? So task switching is something we'll all do. Your ability to do it efficiently, effectively speaks to your level of task switching. And then, of course, learnability is the last one, because you have to be able to process and learn all these things. So if you have a high level of learnability, then you're processing things that are coming in. You're not making the same mistakes. You're learning. Okay, last time I did that, it went into my hippocampus. Now I remember it, right? And I won't do the same thing again. So when we're in dynamic environments, our ability to kind of move through those cycles efficiently, effectively, starts speaking to each of these attributes. That section of the book is probably the only section where the attributes are very much um, synergized and intertwined, right? In other words, you can talk about courage in grit, and you can talk about discipline in drive. When you're in the act of being driven, right? Courage actually, you can use some courage, right? So those can be kind of segmented, but the mental acuity attributes actually all relate, and they're intertwined, because it's all about how your brain processes the world.
There's like overlap.
Overlap.
You said earlier that one way to boost your efficacy in each of these attributes is to kind of lean into the the attributes where you may not be as effective.
Right.
So would you say that something like situational awareness, like how would you improve if you're not the most situationally aware person?
Yeah. First thing I would recommend is take off the headphones and put away the iPhone,
Hmm.
right? And pay attention to your environment, right? First of all, it's beautiful, usually. I mean, because that the world is. Um, I do this as someone who's vigilant. I love walking in New York City. Well, of course, I'm waiting for New York City to get back where it was, right? But pre-COVID, when we had a bunch of people walking around the subways, I love the subway system, and it's because it exercises all these mental acuity attributes for me
Mm.
because it's highly dynamic. There's a lot going on. I have to process information. I have to prioritize. I have to act, and it's thoroughly confusing. So I would say, as an individual who wants to exercise them, just put yourself into environments that allow you to notice things. Now, it could be as simple as, hey, next time you're running in the woods, don't listen to music. Don't turn on your stopwatch. Just notice. Take time to notice. Be present. Meditation. Their meditation practice is all about this, right? Be present in your moment, right? When it comes to compartmentalization, you can start thinking about, okay, what is it that I want to what is my objective in this moment? Okay. Based on that objective, if it might not be as kind of drastic as, I got to find my gate because I'm late for my flight, but it might be, hey, I want to find the local library, whatever that is. Okay, as I'm driving, what are the things I need to notice to help me with that objective and prioritize that way? And then task switching is it happens quite naturally. I think the best thing about the best way to effectively manage your task. Well, you can develop your task switching by doing it more effectively inside whatever context you're looking for. So it's effective when you're developing it. So I have an objective, so I'm going to task switch. So let me give you the airport example. I'm going to look for my gate. As I'm focusing on those gate numbers, I'm also paying attention to the announcements, right? The announcement, and then I hear an announcement say, "Hey, flight whatever is delayed." Well, now I can task switch, right? Because I just heard my flight was delayed. I can say, okay, well now I'm going to focus on Chili's because I'm hungry or want a beer or whatever. So
Mhm.
the problem with task switching is most of us task switch too much, and because of these devices that we have in our pockets, right?
Yeah.
I mean, these mobile phones are literally context. They're boxes of different contexts, right? So when you go from having this conversation, you and I having a conversation, to my phone texting and beeping me, and I make that switch, that's like cognitively leaping from a library to a soccer field, right? My brain has to do the work, and it's been proven that it takes a while to get fully into that next context, especially to leap back, right?
Mm.
So we're actually forcing ourselves oftentimes to context switch when we actually shouldn't be. And by the way, that's exhausting. Our brains only run on about 40 watts of power, right? So when we're constantly asking it to task switch, when it's really not necessary to, well, we're going to be exhausted. This is one of the reasons why these devices are kind of exhausting us, but it's also why we're finding that the connection is not happening as well because we're allowing ourselves to get ripped out of context when we shouldn't be, because we have a beep, even a beep, by the way, even if I heard my phone beep right now, and I decided not to. Well, I'm talking to you, so I'm like, that's still it's a mental it's a mental leap, right? So see, even these alerts, people's like, well, I won't look at my phone. I'll just hear the alert. Well, the alert is a shift in context as well. So
There
be
was
careful.
yeah, there was a very interesting study that came out. I think I cite it in my book, Genius Foods. No, sorry, The Genius Life, where researchers found that just having a smartphone like on the table next to you exerts sort of a I love the way they put it in the study. I remember it because I thought it was so beautifully put. It exerts a gravitational pull
Yeah.
on one's attention.
Yes. Well, is it?
Just having the phone in your
Yeah.
proximity.
Well, and worse yet, so if you and I are talking, if we started this conversation and right beforehand I put my phone on the table, who would you think my priority is? What would you think my priority is?
Well, it's probably not 100% me. It's probably
It's
like
probably not the 100%. Yes,
yeah.
exactly right. So you are in effect, by leaving your phone, even if you're having a dinner with someone, by putting your phone in a visible way, you're actually sending a message, and the message is you're not as important as, well, I would say you're not the only thing that's important right now, right?
Yeah.
That's actually a pretty powerful subconscious message versus I'm going to put this away, right? And this is it. I'm going to focus on you right now. So it can inhibit human relationship too, just by putting a phone on a table in front of you because it's just not showing, it's not sending the right subconscious message.
I love that. I'm loving talking to you. I guess a question that has arisen over the past 40 minutes or so is the goal for people reading this to basically improve their attributes across the board, across all 25 of these attributes, or is it to find the attributes where they currently excel and then to sort of orient their lives around those attributes?
Yeah, I think it's probably it's more general than that. It's really to figure out where you stand and figure out what you want to do.
Hmm.
There is certainly a strength to understanding. So I'm it's kind of this analogy is like to if you want to tweak your engine, the engine of your car, you want to put a bunch of sexy stuff on it. The first thing you better do is probably learn the engine, right? Because you start stacking things on this engine without knowing the engine, things are gonna things are gonna probably start blowing up or whatever, right? I think it's the same thing with us as humans, and we have so much out there right now that purports to make you better if you do this thing or do that thing or stack this or try this technique. And there's nothing wrong with any of them. I think a lot of them actually have a lot of efficacy. Um, but if we don't know ourselves first, then how do we know what to stack? Right? Maybe nitrous oxide is not what my engine needs right now, right? So I think my goal for the book is someone to read it and first understand themselves. What does their own unique palette look like? And then from that point, say, okay, based on what I'd like to do or what I'm doing, what are those attributes that I would like to develop or I have enough of, or like to, I don't think you need to mute attributes, but maybe you do. Maybe narcissism needs to be muted. Um, what do I need to do to maximize my performance? And I think that's the goal. One of the things that we're offering on the website is a free assessment tool. So you go to the website, you can take an assessment for your grit attributes, your drive attributes, and your mental acuity attributes to see where you stand on these things. And it's based on a collection of data of about 1,000 people over, around the world, really. So based on grit, okay, where do I compare to 1,000 people? So it's designed to give the user a snapshot of where they might sit, and then ask them, and then read the book, and then say, okay, where do I actually sit on this based on my assessment, based on the book? Okay, what do I want to improve? And if I say, you know what, maybe I do need a little bit more empathy. Okay, how do I develop empathy? Right. And I'm also put stuff on the site to help people develop that too, if you want to develop each attribute.
What's the website?
The website is theattributes.com. Yeah,
Theattributes.com.
pretty simple.
That's awesome.
So yeah, I think it's a little bit of both. It's really, there's no, I'm really fascinated with human potential, and human potential is what could be, right? But to reach what could be, we have to understand where we sit first, because what my could be is different than what your could be is, right? So I think it's really important for people to understand where they sit. Introspective, kind of self analysis. Where do I sit? How do I show up to the game? What do I have? What are my strengths? What are my weaknesses? Okay, with that, how do I then start marching towards my potential?
You mentioned that narcissism is an attribute,
Yeah.
which is interesting because I tend to think about narcissism as usually being not a good thing. I've just been told that, Max, you're too narcissistic, and I
Yeah.
usually get smacked on the hand for it, proverbially. So how is narcissism a good thing,
Well, it's
or
certainly
an attribute worth cultivating?
Yeah, it's certainly a pejorative word. It's so I wanted to explore because I was trying to figure out what drives people, and narcissism is certainly a word that we've heard a lot of these last several years. And I think that it was one of these things that I said, you know what, I kind of had to think back to my own experience, and I can't speak for every SEAL, but I will speak for many when I say to you this: that most SEALs, we become SEALs not necessarily because we're patriotic or for love of country. Okay, we are patriotic. We love our country, but most of us become SEALs because we want to be badasses, right? We want to do something that very few people do. We want to see if we have what it takes, right? There's narcissism behind that. There's this
Hmm.
ability. There's this desire to stand out, to be recognized, to be special. Um, we This is biological, by the way. When we are infants and we're being paid attention to by our parents, okay, we are getting bursts of serotonin, dopamine, and oxytocin. Okay, those are three very powerful chemicals. Dopamine and serotonin being neurotransmitters, they're kind of immediate. Oxytocin being the more longer term hormone. um, so when we get paid attention to, it feels good, right? So it feels good to stand out, be said. All of us want to do that somehow, in some way. We all want to feel special to someone. We want to be paid attention to in some ways, right? So narcissism is, I want to kind of humanize it, to say, hey, it's okay to be narcissistic. It's okay to want to stand out. I mean, listen, some of our greatest performers or scientists or whomever, they went down those roads because they wanted to be different. They wanted to be special. They wanted to stand out. Nothing wrong with that. It becomes wrong when it gets overboard, right? So narcissistic personality disorder is a codified disorder, right? In the DSM-5, there's 9 categories of qualities that you exhibit. That if you have, I think they say if you have any one of them, right, you have the disorder. Well, if you read those 9, you're like, okay, I don't have that, but I've felt elements of that, So, and there's nothing wrong with that, right? So, I think narcissism was one of those things we had to kind of, that I was really interested in saying, okay, how does it affect drive? How does it drive people? And if we are able to effectively recognize it in ourselves and say, okay, I want to be special. I want to stand out. I'm going to use this to my advantage, but make sure that I don't get overboard. That therein lies the problem, right? Because narcissism is like a vampire staring in the mirror, right? It's very difficult, if not impossible, to see in ourselves. So we have to be very careful about it. And the way we inoculate ourselves against narcissism is through our trusted, loving relationships. Those people who we know we love and they love us and they tell us the truth and they tell us when we're getting out over our skis and they say, hey, your head's getting too big, stop it, right? Those are the people who keep us in check. My wife has done this for me for 20 years, right? She is my grounding wire, right? And she always will be. And my kids are the same way. So it's always funny, when the house, I think Barack Obama said recently, he was being asked about, being the president and how how he's viewed in his household. And he's like, what are you talking about? You're never the prophet in your own land, right? And that's such a good thing to say, because if that's the case, then you have a great land, because that means you're being grounded, right? And to establish relationships around you of people who love you and trust you enough and care for you enough to keep you in check is the key. True narcissists who with the actual disorder will surround themselves with sycophants, right?
Hmm.
And if someone ceases to be a sycophant, they're ejected from the group. Usually they self-eject as they get sick of it themselves. And as soon as they do, they're demonized, right? As soon as you leave that group, the narcissist demonizes that person, right? So you can tell narcissists. You can start seeing. Well, it's usually pretty easy to see on the outside, right? But if you are in a circle, and you can kind of see this honestly, and it's a bunch of people who only agree with you, only you're kind of always the center of attention. You're never wrong, right? You may want to check yourself, right? Because it's those deep relationships that really are the inoculation. But
I know so many people like that. Maybe not so many, but I've come across one or two in my time living in LA and working in sort of the media business. And yeah, they're not fun to be around if you're not a sycophant.
It's true, yeah, and that's why those groups are typically they're not they're very short term, right?
Hmm.
They're constantly swapping out people, and I would say, there's another beauty of, I think, being in the SEAL teams, is you were surrounded by people who really took themselves and each other very seriously, enough that we want all of us to perform, because at the end of the day, it's not only your life, but your buddies, um, and the environment. If you're consistently putting yourself into environments that humble you, so you're not going to find a lot of big wave surfers, for example, who are not humble, because the ocean is the most humbling environment on the planet, right? So environmentally, you can do this too. The environment humbles you as well, and so I think finding ways to be humble, to understand you're good, but it's the difference between confidence and arrogance, right? I mean, confidence, hey, I can do this, I know I can. Arrogance is, I'm better than other people,
Yeah.
and I got nothing to learn, right?
Yeah.
And that's not the case.
I'm so glad that being a narcissist is not an inherently, or being somewhat narcissist, having somewhat. I'm just like burying myself in a ditch here, but like having somewhat narcissistic attributes is not an inherently bad thing. It's when it's out of balance with other sort of personality traits
That's right.
when it becomes problematic.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Some of our greatest iconoclasts had narcissistic tendencies, and we have them to thank for some of the greatest inventions and discoveries on the planet.
I love that. I feel so much better about myself. Thank you for that, Rich. So we don't have that much time left, but I just want to touch on the umbrella category into which narcissism fits, and that's drive, because I think that drive is something that many people, kind of struggle with, especially today when, when there is so much uncertainty, as you described. So what can we expect by diving into that section of the book?
Well, there are 5 attributes that make it up. First is self-efficacy, and self-efficacy is kind of a combination of a couple of things. It's not just this "I got this" or "I could," just do it type thing. It's this mentality that it's a combination between confidence, initiative, and optimism, right? And you have all 3 of those. Each one of those by itself is inert, right? Confidence on its own doesn't do much, right? I'm confident I could fly a plane because my dad was a pilot, my brother's a pilot. I grew up loving flying. I'm confident I could do it, but I've never flown a plane, right? So confidence on its own doesn't work. Initiative, again, you need the ability to take that first step, and initiative on its own without being buttressed by something else, especially optimism or realism, could be dangerous, right? You can put a 6-year-old in the driver's seat of a car. He's going to have the initiative. He or she is going to have the initiative to step on that accelerator, right? But without purpose, it's dangerous, right? And then optimism tempered with realism, but not to the extent that it becomes pessimism, right? So I know I can do this, right? I have the initiative to start, and then I know along the way I will figure it out, right? So it's kind of that long term self efficacy. So that's number one. Discipline is number two, and discipline I found fascinating because I had to separate discipline with self discipline, because they're two different things, as I discovered. And I did this through self analysis, really, because um, I am highly unself disciplined as a human being. I just find it very difficult, and what I realized was self discipline is largely internally focused. I can eat right, I can work out, right? There's nothing about the external world. The external world doesn't have a lot of say in one's self discipline, right? Um, Discipline, however, and the kind I talk about in the book, is the ability to see and achieve long-term objectives, right? Of which the external world has a part, right? I want to get that big promotion. I want to write that book. I want to become a Navy SEAL. I want to become a successful podcaster. The external world has a say in that, right? And so discipline holistically involves the ability to move through that process, and move through the highs and the lows and be able to get to your objective. Self-discipline, the highly self-disciplined person is such usually because that person loves structure and structure is certainty, right? So sometimes being too self-disciplined can actually affect your overall discipline, right?
Hmm.
Because like you said, to be able to get where you are today, you had to march into uncertainty. Well, uncertainty is by definition uncertain, right? Which means you likely had to break structure quite a bit just to navigate that space, right? So the most successful people are the people who are both self-disciplined and disciplined, right? They know how to balance those things. But I separated because I thought it was important. There are very, very highly successful people who are very disciplined in their achievements that as, very unself-disciplined, right? They didn't have a lot of self-discipline. So I separated that. Um, the next one is open-mindedness, which really is very self-explanatory. I mean, the closed mind is a certain mind, and to be certain about that which you'd understand is to court disaster. I
Hmm.
would say, right? You have to be able to look at things from a different optic. Um, Cunning is one that again can be pejorative, but this is really in short the ability to think outside the box, right? We are all guilty of when we're faced with problems, a bias that comes with that problems. Oftentimes, those biases are given to us in the form of rules or conditions, right? And in fact, a problem that needs to be solved has two criteria. It has a solution. It requires a solution or objective, and it has conditions or variables, right? The cunning mind starts to take those variables and conditions and asks, okay, are those actually real or perceived, and can I break them, right? And if you can break them, that's what the cunning mind does, right? Cunning is again one of the primary qualities of successful Navy SEALs is cunning, the ability to think outside the box, to break rules, right? Because again, in back in the days of Draper Kaufman, these guys who were swimming across the beach, sometimes they'd have to swim across the beach to frustrate or sabotage enemy lines. Well, these are 5-man groups with pistols and swim fins, right? I mean,
Hmm.
these if they get caught, they are dead, captured at the best, right? So they had to be cunning in the way that they attacked the enemy. They were surgical in their objective versus kind of in mass, right? So cunning is a huge thing, and I think cunning is a really effective attribute when it comes to drive because it allows you to think about problems that come your way in different ways, and so that's why I talk about cunning. And then finally, narcissism we talked about, but this idea that hey, my desire to stand out and be paid attention to matters, and it's driving me, and there's nothing, that's just the truth. It is. I mean, ask anybody who's made it big, and part of that desire was to stand out.
I love it. What are some things that readers gain when they learn about the 25 different attributes and then work in their own lives to improve on them?
They will gain an understanding about themselves and their performance. I think they will be able to index the things they learned in this book about how they managed through 2020, and by doing that, how they can excel in 2021 because they learned a lot. And I guarantee there were some of the attributes that they didn't have a lot of that they developed the heck out of in 2020. It just made them do it. The environment made them do it, so they can learn about what they developed. So gain an understanding of themselves, uh, dissect what is required to achieve their next goal or their objective. That's the kind of the individual. As teams, it allows a team to understand, okay, what is this team, what is this team's capability in terms of their collection of attributes, and what are our gaps? I mean, what are we missing? Because the best teams are teams that are collection, are kind of a mesh between attributes, right? I talk about others in the book. There's three other attributes I talk about because I talk about them because either polarity is good, right? So there's competitiveness or non-competitiveness. Both are actually good. If you have a competitive person and a non-competitive person on a team, you're in great shape, right?
Hmm.
Because a competitive person is very good when it comes to understanding the rules of the game, right? And they can look at an environment and immediately start to say, okay, these are the rules, and here's how to win, and
Hmm.
not only win but crush it, right? The non-competitive person, again, I've never been competitive either. I've always been non-competitive. I've always looked at the pack and be like, what are those people? What else is going on? I don't want to be part of that pack, right?
Hmm.
The non-competitive person will see avenues outside the pack, right? And so to have both polarities on a team is actually powerful. So to understand the attributes from respect to a team or business, I think, can be very effective. And then just ask yourself, where can I go from here? I think that's again, understand your own engine and your team's engine. I think is the goal.
Hey, if you like that video, you need to check out this one here, and I'll see you there.
It takes on average 17 years for it to go from study to being used in a clinical practice. It makes no sense.
It's maddening.
At this time in human history, when we have access to the data, but the beautiful part is at the same time, folks like us can take the information, make it make sense for everybody so we can start using it now.